some time ago, actually it was probably 6 or 8 weeks ago, we were having a full day of activities going on. It was like the first of the month, and we had the potluck, and then we had a group, whoever wanted to stay, we all got together and we sat around in the friendship room and we talked, and we had a Bible study. And before we actually got into studying from Revelation, we actually started talking about what was our favorite Bible story. And we went around and we were talking. There were probably, 15, 20 of us in there. Some of you may actually remember this. And one of the Bible stories that came up was the Shunammite woman. Do you remember the Shunammite woman? Do you remember? and we a lot of questions came up. Now, the Shunammite woman, was she the one that her son was raised from the dead? And somebody said, I don't know, I don't think so. No, was the Shunammite woman, was she the one who filled all the jars with oil and sold them so she could pay her bills? No, I don't remember. Well, maybe was the Shunammite woman the one who ran out of oil and flour and was going to make the last bread for her and her son? Was it her? Remember? No, I don't remember if that was the Shunammite woman or not. Oh, I know. The Shunammite woman was the one whose husband built a room for one of the prophets, and he used to stay there a lot. Well, and somebody said, well, wasn't that Elijah? Somebody else said, no, I think it was Elisha. And we had that conversation, and I realized, it's been a long, long time since I've actually looked at some of those old stories from the Bible that I used to listen to all the time when I was a kid. We used to read from Arthur Maxwell's Bible story volumes, and we went through those as kids. We went through that. Dad always wanted to read a story, and we wouldn't let him read any less than 3 or 4 of them. We just, for 2 reasons, we really liked them, and when he was done, we had to go to bed. So we read a lot of those stories. But I tried to think about some of those stories, because now that I'm older, I tend to think about things other than stories. And as I thought about that, I realized there were a lot of things about the stories I don't remember, like which prophet was it? Was it Elijah? When I was a kid, I used to get confused all the time about, especially the stories in the Old Testament. Was that Elijah or was it Elisha? And which one was that? And it turns out I went home after that and I looked up some of those stories. Which prophet was it that raised a young boy, a son, back to life? It was Elijah and Elisha. They both did it. The one that was mentioned in the scripture reading this morning was the widow of Zarephath, and that was Elijah. And the other one was the Shunammite woman, and that was Elisha. So it's been so long that it was confusing. So I said, you know what? Because that was about, I'm saying a month and a half ago. Then last week, Elder George Silver did the children's story. Do you remember who it was on? Naaman. I heard it. Somebody was paying attention, and it was Naaman. And I thought that was interesting because when I found out that I was supposed to preach, I thought maybe I ought to preach on one of those stories that we had talked about that Sabbath afternoon. I said, my favorite was Naaman the leper. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to talk about Naaman the leper and see if we can't find something a little deeper in that in terms of a sermon. And then George told the story to the children last week on Naaman the leper. I said, well, there goes that. And but then I said, no, my buddy George knew what he was doing. He introduced the kids to Naaman the leper. And it turns out they're not here today, so they don't have to be bored by hearing the same story twice. But I thought, when I looked at that story, I realized that in those verses, there was some messages that was, I would call it Naaman Part 2, the advanced story. Because there are so many points in all the way through that whole story. Every verse I found something. And I said, you know what? I think it would be fun for us to look at that story and go through verse by verse, because every verse had something to say about the Lord. So we're going to do that. But before we do that, you can start looking at it now if you want to, but it's 2 Kings and 2 Kings 4, I think. I got it written down here, but I don't have it in front of me. No, 2 Kings 5. 2 Kings 5. Now, and we're going to be talking about the prophet Elisha, because Naaman was healed through the prophet Elisha. And if you remember Elijah and Elisha, they were two different personalities. Do you remember Elijah? He's the Mount Carmel prophet, all the fire and all the, and he's the prophet with a still small voice. He's the prophet that was always on top of Ahab and Jezebel. He was a kind of a fiery kind of a prophet. It turns out that when Elisha took over the mantle, and literally took over the mantle, you remember when Elijah was taken to heaven in a fiery chariot of angels, his mantle fell and landed on the shoulders of Elisha. Another thing that you may not realize that's not the first time you hear about Elisha. Elisha had actually worked with Elijah for years. Elisha was probably on Mount Carmel with Elijah, because they did things together, and Elisha was learning from Elijah. So they were together. In fact, after Ahab was killed in a battle, Jezebel, her death came about because of Elisha. If you'd like to know how that happened, look it up. So they were entirely different. So before we talk about Naaman, I want to introduce you to Elisha. Ellen White refers to Elisha as the prophet of peace. His work was somewhat different from that of Elijah. Elijah had been given messages to give to the people of condemnation and messages of judgment. Elisha's was more personal, more peaceful, more hands-on with the people themselves. The people loved him. He traveled all around that area there on missions of visitation, His methodology was more personal, working with the people. Elijah was a little more fiery, and even though Elisha was more mild-mannered and of a kindly spirit, he was stern when he needed to be. And you probably remember the story. If you want to turn to 2 Kings 2, we'll look at that story. It's only 2 verses long. 2 Kings 2, and we'll look at verses 23 and 24. And we're talking about Elisha here. Elisha was on his way to Bethel. He had just assisted in an issue in one of the villages. So we'll start reading in verse 23, and you'll remember this story, I'm sure. Then he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up the road, some youths came out. By the way, I'm reading from the New King James Version. As he was going up the road, some youths came from the city and mocked him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." Now, what's interesting about this, when I was a kid, I I've heard this story before. You probably have as well. And I was thinking, so here's a 4 or 5, maybe a half dozen unruly teenagers who were out to give him a bad time. And interestingly enough, they actually came out of the city to mock and tease and harass Elisha. That was why they were going out there to meet him. They intended to mock him. That was going to be their fun for the day. And it's obvious the fact that he said, "Go up, you bald head," that they were aware of what had happened to Elijah. And they knew that Elijah had gone up to heaven. And the fact that they would tease Elisha about that very event, which to anyone who had a godly spirit would realize, that was a pretty solemn event. That was something that had some meaning to godly people. It was something that was particularly meaningful to Elisha, because that's when he accepted Elijah's mantle and became God's prophet to Samaria, the kingdom of Israel. For Elisha, when they started teasing him and calling him, "Go up, thou bald head," that captured his attention. And he turned around and looked at them. Now, he was trying to ignore them, and obviously he had already gone by them and was trying to continue on. But when he heard that, verse 24, he turned around and looked at them and pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Now, I don't know what that means, really. I've never had anybody curse me and have something bad happen to me, so I don't know how that works. I looked into the spirit of prophecy on this in the book Prophets and Kings, and Ellen White says that he was moved by inspiration to place a curse on them. In other words, the Holy Spirit had told him, had impressed him, that something needs to be done to stifle these brats. And so he turned around and placed a curse on them, and then it says that 2 she-bears, 2 female bears, came out of the woods and mauled them. And I found out an interesting thing in that verse right at the end there. It came out and mauled how many of them? 42. So that mob of youth were at least 42 in size. That's a mob. And they mauled them. Now, when I heard this story when I was a kid, I got the impression that the bears had killed them, but they didn't. I didn't realize. In fact, I actually felt relieved when I read the story this time, because I thought that they had killed them, and I thought that's pretty harsh. Why would God allow them to be killed? They're just kids having fun, right? I want to read something to you from Patriarchs and Prophets. And so I'm thinking to myself, that's harsh. Why would you go that far? Well, first of all, they were ungodly youth. That's obvious because of the way that they were mocking and teasing Elisha, and the way they were talking about such a solemn event as the prophet Elijah departing and going to heaven. They obviously were making fun of that. So, this is what she said. Had Elisha, see, I was getting confused again already. Had Elisha allowed the mockery to pass unnoticed, he would have continued to be ridiculed and reviled by the rabble, and his mission to instruct and save in a time of grave national peril might have been defeated. This one instance of terrible severity was sufficient to command respect throughout his life. For 50 years he went in and out of the gate of Bethel and to and fro in the land, from city to city, passing through crowds of idle, rude, dissolute youth, but none mocked him or made light of his qualifications as the prophet of the Most High. Reverence, in which the youth who mocked Elisha were so lacking, is a grace that should be carefully cherished. That's reverence, is a grace that should be carefully cherished. Every child should be taught to show true reverence for God. Never should his name be spoken lightly or thoughtlessly. Angels, as they speak it, you know what they do? They veil their faces. With what reverence should we, who are fallen and sinful, take it upon our lips? The angels veil their faces. They cover their faces with their wings when they say the name of the Lord. And here were this rabble who was taking this solemn event and mocking Elisha about it. When I read it in that context, they probably should have been punished. And I see it a little differently now. But anyway, besides the point that we should be teaching, we should be showing reverence for sacred things, and we should be teaching that of our children. That was kind of like the secondary point, extremely important point. By the way, you understand where I'm coming from, aren't you? Don't you? I hope. I just cringe every time I'm walking down the street and somebody says, "Oh my God." I cringe. I can't tell you how many times I've heard it in church. I'm waiting for a bolt of lightning to come down out of the sky. We should, especially at this time when we look at what's going on out in the world, we should be more careful about how we talk and exhibit our love for God or our lack thereof. Because at no time in the world have we needed him more than now. So that wasn't the point of my sermon, but I wanted to make it clear in our discussion about Elisha why he was so taken aback when they started making fun of him and Elijah and the work they had to do. All right, so I just wanted to mention a little bit about Elijah. This was a one-time incident. What it actually told me was that there's even a limit to kindness. At some point, we have to call sin by its right name. At some point, we can be kind and loving and reverent and faithful, but at some point, we have to stop and do the right thing and make sure when we hear or see people saying or doing things that draw the wrong picture of the God we love, something probably should be said. I've been reticent to do that on occasion when I probably should have said something, but I've been reticent to do that because I don't want that individual to start pointing his finger at me and say, "Oh, go away, you bald head." But at some point, we have to take the bull by the horns, and we have to make sure that we know in whom we believe. All right, let's. I had to say that it was in the Bible. It was actually leading up to the point of Naaman, and I couldn't let it go. So please forgive me. In considering the story of Naaman, it's important that we understand what's going on in the world at that time. The God's chosen people had split into two kingdoms. There was the kingdom in the south, the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom. They had a series of prophets. In fact, I made a list of them here. I had a list of them. Oops. Oh, here it is. To Israel, God sent Ahijah, Jehu, Hosea, Elijah, Elisha, and Jonah. You've heard of all of those, right? You knew the story of Jonah. You know about Elijah, Elisha, Jehu. Jehu was the fast driver. We played a Bible game called Bible Seek when I was growing up. And one of the questions in that you had to answer was, who was a fast chariot driver? And you looked up the verse, and it turned out to be the prophet Jehu, which I thought was interesting. He liked to drive fast. Anyway, we've heard of these before, but did you know to which kingdom each of those prophets went? Some of them you probably did. We know the story of Jonah. He actually went to Syria, was at Nineveh, not Damascus, Nineveh, to bring a message there. And he was also known for his prophesying in the northern part of the northern kingdom of Israel. Isaiah, Jeremiah, the first of the prophets before the split of the kingdom was, you remember, Samuel. So over the years, God sent a number of prophets to warn them of their fate if they did not change and return to the Lord and remain faithful. But the political climate there was that these two nations were also at war with some of the northern kingdoms like Assyria and Babylon. The northern kingdom of Israel at the time of Elisha beyond was actually on the verge of being captured by Assyria. In fact, there was a war. The Syrian king Hadad went to war with Israel, the king, and in that battle, that's when Ahab was killed. And ever since that time, the two countries of Syria, also called Assyria, the two countries of Assyria and Israel were fighting border conflicts all the time. And it was in one of those border conflicts that Naaman captured the young slave girl and made her a slave to wait on his wife. But they were going back and forth all the time, tussling on the border between Syria and Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah stayed faithful a little longer, and in fact, in general, the kings of Judah were in general good kings, as the Bible said, followed after their father David. The northern kingdom tended to be the kings who were reprobates. And the southern kingdom stayed true longer and were eventually overrun by Babylon. The northern kingdom was overrun before that by Assyria and taken captive. So there were these border conflicts going on, and Naaman was the commander. And we're going to start talking about Naaman now. So if you want to turn to 2 Kings 5, and we'll start with verse 1. Now, what I'm going to do, and you may or may not like it, I don't care. We're going to start reading the verses, and I'm going to read them with you so you can read along with me. And I'm going to start reading the verses, and I will stop every once in a while to either make a point or ask a question or see if you're still with me. And so we're going to start reading, and we're starting with verse 1 of 2 Kings 5. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. That's an interesting statement. Who did the Lord give victory to? Why? Any idea why? Because they were falling away from the Lord, and the Lord was trying to bring them back. And actually, the prophets of the time were telling the Israelites, the kingdom of Israel, if you don't change your ways, you're going to be overrun. And when they didn't change their ways, God gave the victory to Syria. That's what it means when it says, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. Now, he was the commander of the army for the king of Syria, and he was a leper. How were lepers treated in Israel? Outcasts. Unclean. They had to, when they went anywhere, they had to shout out, unclean, unclean. They lived in the dredges of society. What's with Naaman? He was a leper. It seemed to me that they didn't seem to have the same attitude towards leprosy. You could still carry on an occupation, apparently. And I wondered why that was. And I'm just surmising here, but is it possible that God's people saw leprosy as a symbolism for sin? And when they thought of sinners, who did they think of? Lepers. Which is one reason why when lepers were healed, when Jesus healed the lepers, or they no longer had the disease, they had to go to, where did they have to go? They had to go to the temple to be declared clean, because to them, leprosy represented sin. And when you're cured of leprosy, you needed to become clean by not just physically, but you had to be declared clean religiously. So because of that attitude is probably, I'm thinking, why it was so differently considered by other countries. Verse 2, and the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Verse 3, then she said to her mistress, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Samaria is where the kingdom of Israel was in the area called Samaria. She said to her mistress, Naaman's wife, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. I thought that was interesting. Obviously, this young girl had been raised by God-fearing parents. And she, it seems to me, unconsciously was doing what the Israelites were supposed to be doing all along, and that's witnessing to the countries around them. They were of the opinion that they were God's special people and no one else could fit the bill. That's not what God intended for them, is it? Is that what God intended for them to do? Isn't it ironic that a slave girl in a foreign country was the one who was doing the witnessing that God expected the entire nation to do? I just thought that was an interesting aside. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus said the girl who was from the land of Israel." I would like to have heard the thus and thus. I would like to have known just exactly what it was he said. Then the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. That's a lot of stuff. Wealthy stuff. 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, and this is what the letter said, "Now be advised when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy." Who did he send the letter to? The king. Who should he have sent it to? Elisha, right? Should have sent it to the prophet. Now, look at how the king responded. This. And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? What did he send him to me for? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." Now, this is the time, remember, what's going on the borders? Battles. And they were apparently, the king said, "He's trying to make a quarrel with me. He wants a fight." What should the king have done when he got this letter and Naaman showed up? What do you think he should have done? Shouldn't he have sent him to Elisha? What does that say about the character of the king? And would it surprise you to know that he probably was a bad king? See, it seemed to me when I read this that the king should have realized what was going on here, that the king of Syria is sending his army commander to be healed of leprosy. And the king, knowing that, and by the way, I think the reason why, because somewhere the message got messed up. The little girl said if Naaman went to see the prophet in Israel, and the king ends up sending him to the king of Israel, so that got a little messed up. But remember, Naaman went to his boss, the king, and asked for him to send a message. And the king thinking, well, to send a message to Israel, I need to send it to the king. Kings talk to kings. And that may be where it got mixed up. But when he got that message, the king, who obviously, the only reason I could think why he didn't send him on to Elisha is because A, he didn't know Elisha, or B, he didn't care to know Elisha, or he had no idea who Elisha was and what he did. What does that say about this guy's spirituality? So why didn't he send him? I don't know. But obviously it created a problem. And word apparently got out because Elisha heard about it. Next verse. So it was when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." Mr. King, you should have known there was a prophet in Israel. Send him to see me. So when he showed up, Naaman showed up. He went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. Did Elisha come out and see him? Now, look at verse 10. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, but you shall be clean." Look at verse 11. But Naaman became furious. In fact, before I ask the question, I'm going to continue. But Naaman became furious and went away and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call out on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy." Why would Naaman get mad about that? He wanted to be healed. He was told to go and see Elisha, finally. And Elisha didn't even come out to see him. Well, there's part one. Elisha didn't come out and see him, but he did tell him what to do. And Naaman was getting madder by the minute. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Why would I go? And by the way, based on where he had come from and where he ended up, in order for him to go to the Jordan River, he'd be going in the wrong direction. To get home, he had to go north. The Jordan River was east. So that made him mad. So he started leaving. So he turned and went away in a rage, and his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" I thought it was interesting that his servants question him. I would think that if you were a servant or a slave and your master decided to do something, would you care whether he did something or not? To me, this says something about the kind of a man that Naaman was, that even his servants would call him father and suggest to him that, why wouldn't you do this? That's a simple thing. Just go to the Jordan River and dip in it 7 times and see what happens. If you're healed, so much the better. If you're not, what have you lost? I thought it was interesting that the servants would come to him and counsel him and comfort him and ask him to do this simple thing. So he went down, verse 14. So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. Before I finish that sentence, he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. Wouldn't you like to have watched him do that? He goes down to the river and he says, "Okay, I'll dip 7 times." So he dips out, he takes off his clothes, goes into the river, and dips once and comes up, and nothing's happened. Wouldn't you think that if it's going to take 7 times to make me clean, the first time I dip, I'd start to see some difference? I start to see something happening. He dips the 2nd time, gets up, nothing's changed. 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, nothing's changed. Wouldn't you think that when you get to be more than halfway done, I'd see something? Naaman saw nothing. And yet he continued to go on. 6 times, nothing happened. 7th time, he gets up. Maybe he starts to feel a little tingle because the leprosy is healing. I don't know. I thought it was interesting that he would, even after seeing nothing happening after dipping 6 times, he continued to do it. To me, that tells me that there is something in him when he decided that he would go do it, something about his character may have been changing here. He was mad that he was asked to go dip in the Jordan River. He was mad because Elisha wouldn't even come out and talk to him. By the way, why do you think Elisha didn't come out and talk to him? Any ideas? Is it possible that Elisha knew that in order for this to work, Naaman had to have a change of heart? Naaman had to get over his anger. Naaman had to get over his haughty, arrogant pride that he wouldn't even come out and see me. And he had to get over that before he would have a heart that was amenable, acceptable to the change that was going to happen. Just a little surmising. I think there's a lot, in these little stories that we heard when we were kids, there's a lot going on in here that we don't understand until we are older. And our minds can wrap itself around what's actually going on here. So, where did I leave off? Oh, so he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan. That would have been interesting to watch. According to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was cleaned. What would you do if that happened? Wouldn't you say, well, it worked, and head home? Not Naaman. To me, this also says something about his character. And he returned, this is verse 15, and he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, and came and stood before him. And he said, indeed, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now that's an interesting statement. Why would he say that? I just got healed. I have seen something happen here. And because of that, I now know that there's no God like the God in Israel. It almost could be that he's simply saying, wow, I just had to do that and I could be healed. There's some magic in these waters here. I think that the fact that he responded the way he did is proof that he had a change of heart, and he recognized that in order for him to be healed, he had to get rid of his arrogance, he had to get rid of his reliance on his own ability, and he knew that it wasn't the act of dipping that healed him. It was the act of believing in the prophet of the Lord and doing it because that's what he needed to do to be cleaned, to be saved. Indeed, I now know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. I think that what was going on in his mind was the same thing that has to really go on in our mind if we're going to accept God as the God of Israel, as our Lord and Savior. We have to have a change of heart. We cannot rely on ourselves or anything we do. We have to do what we have to do because we've been told to do it by the God who will heal us. Naaman was a smart guy. And so he says, I now know that God is the God of all. Now, therefore, please take a gift from your servant. I also get the impression by what's happening here that when he told Elisha to take a gift, it wasn't something he felt that he had to do. When somebody does something for you, you pay him. I think he actually realized that, and I'm sure Elisha realized this too, that this was actually a gift from the heart, for a gift of gratitude. But Elisha knew. By the way, why wouldn't Elisha take the gift? Any ideas? Why wouldn't he take the gift? For him to take the gift would be for him to admit that there was something in all of this that he did to make that happen. He knew nothing he said or did had anything to do with the healing and the cleansing of Naaman. And he could not take credit for it. He couldn't take credit for any part of it. And I think that may be one reason why he didn't even come out to see Naaman when he showed up the first time. It's because Naaman had to understand that he, Elisha, had nothing to do with this. He was just telling him to do what to do as a message from God. And but as the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive nothing. That's Elisha talking to Naaman. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. So Naaman said, and now this gets, for me, the next couple of verses is very interesting to me. I don't know if it will be to you, but that's all right. It was interesting to me. So Naaman said, then if not, and Naaman is saying this now to Elisha, if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth. When he says, please let your servant, was he talking about Gehazi? Gehazi, by the way, was Elisha's servant. And so when he says, please let your servant be given 2 mule, is he saying, let me give Gehazi a couple mule loads of dirt? No. Please let your servant was Naaman's way of identifying himself as a servant of the God of Elisha. Please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. As a kid, and in fact, not until years later, did I realize what Naaman was doing here. When he said, your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. There was a custom in the day that when you wanted to set aside a plot of ground or an area or a place to be your place of worship, whether it was worship of God or worship of Baal or worship of Ashtaroth or whoever, that you would set aside a plot of ground where that worship will occur, and nothing else would take place on that plot of ground but the worship of the God you were worshiping. And what Naaman was saying here is, I want a couple of mule loads of earth from here that I can take with me and set aside a plot of ground that I will worship your God on, my God now. That will be my place of worship, and I will set it aside, and I will use dirt from here to make that possible. Now, that's not spelled out here. I never learned that until many years later. But it makes sense now. Yet in this thing may the Lord, and then he goes on to say, yet in this thing may the Lord, and you probably, you know the story, you know what he's going to say. This really puzzled me. Well, it didn't puzzle me so much as I wonder what he's thinking. Yet in this thing, verse 18, yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant. May the Lord, and notice the wording there. When he says the Lord, he's not talking about Elisha. Who is he talking about? He's talking about God. He's talking about the God of the Israelites. He's talking about the Lord God. If you are reading from the New King James, when the translators translated the word for God, they made it distinctive. If you look at the word the Lord is all capital L followed by small caps. And anytime anytime you see that, you know that is translated as the Lord, God. Yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing. I thought that was interesting. He knew that part of his duties as the commander of the Syrian king's army was that he would also be required to go into the temple of Rimmon with the king, because the king will, apparently the king places his hand on Naaman when he bows down to worship. And Naaman wanted it to be perfectly clear to Elisha and to anyone who might see him doing that, which is part of his duty as the commander of the army, that they would realize that this was a duty he was performing for the king. It had nothing to do with his worship of the God of the king, that his worship was only to the Lord God. Now, I thought that was interesting. It's almost like, it's not the same, but it's almost like I do something I'm not supposed to do, but it's okay because I've asked the Lord to forgive me ahead of time. And you understand the danger in that, don't you? But this is not what Naaman was asking. This is not at all what Naaman was asking. And then he says, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing. Now, what's interesting here is, who is the Lord? Is he talking to Elisha? He's talking to Elisha, but who is he talking about? May the Lord, notice the way it's spelled, he's talking about the God of Elisha, who is now his God. May the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing. Now, I thought it was interesting that Elisha did not say, sure, that'll happen. He didn't say that. Then he said to him, go in peace. Now, the implication, of course, is he's telling him, go in peace. That's fine. I get it. I know what you're doing. I know what you want to do. So he departed from him a short distance. Now, there's another indication of why I think that it was perfectly okay for him to do that. And that's because God approved of it. How do I know that? Because in Luke, we're told that Naaman was cleansed of his leprosy in the Old Testament. And if Jesus is recognizing the actions of Naaman all those centuries later, Jesus knew Naaman. And Jesus seems to be approving of Naaman as one who was worthy. That tells me, at least I read into that God did in fact pardon him for that thing which he had to do as the commander of the army, because Naaman's heart was right with the Lord. So it tells me that it's not what we do or what we say, it's what happens to us because of a change of our heart, that our actions and our words are predicated, driven by our heart that is in line with the heart of God. So I like that. Now, I'm not going to go on because Gehazi makes me mad. So he said, go in peace. So he parted from him a short distance. Now, that short distance is explained later on, but we're not going to go into that. Now, I wonder, looking at this story, I wonder if I myself would have responded the same way Naaman did. How would I have responded when I dipped in the muddy Jordan River 6 times and nothing had happened? Would I even have gone? What a foolish thing to ask me to do is go dip in that dirty water, and that'll cleanse me of my leprosy. I have tried everything. I've been to every doctor in the land, and nothing. It's a death sentence. No matter where I go, I travel a lot. No matter where I go, no matter what country I raid, people with leprosy die. There's nothing that can be done for them. Why would dipping 7 times in the dirty Jordan River, how would I respond to that? Naaman, fortunately for Naaman, is much smarter than I am. I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not sure I would have seen the implications of what was going on there. In fact, the only way I would have seen the implications was if God made it clear to me. And maybe that's what he did for Naaman too. But nevertheless, Naaman made a decision, and that decision was, I will do what what Elisha's Lord tells me to do, because I believe he can do that. He had to be talked into it, but he wouldn't have done it if he didn't think it. Why would he have even bothered? He said it himself. Why should I dip in this dirty old river? We've got rivers at home that are much better. In fact, I looked it up. The Pharpar, it's surrounded. The river is surrounded by groves of trees. It was a place where the residents of Syria would go for picnics. It was idyllic. If that's where I came from, and I looked at the muddy Jordan River near its source, which is where it would have been, the upper end of the Jordan River, it is dirty and muddy. In fact, at the time of the year this may have happened, it's mostly dry. So would I have had the courage to do what he did? I would hope so. I would hope that I have had enough happen in my life to convince me that God is God, that he loves me. He will never ask me to do anything that would harm me. He has my best interests at heart. Would I respond like Naaman did? I would hope so. But he continues to test me to see if I will. I know he does the same thing for you. Give him the glory he deserves. He doesn't expect us to veil our faces when we mention his name, but he does expect us to reverence him and to give him our lives.